So let's pick up Aristotle's Poetics, and what I'm going to do in this video is chapters 5 and 6. So the previous video, 1 to 4, have a look at that if you haven't already. All right, so again, lots going on, and I'm going to hit some of the highlights to help guide you through this very interesting work. So, chapter 5, he talks a little bit about comedy, right? And so Aristotle is, talking about the various branches of what, remember, it was this initial sort of amorphous kind of mass of things, this project of imitation and whatnot that people are doing, and then eventually becomes differentiated, right? So it's this notion of imitation is the key thing, and then people, according to their character, decide what they want to talk about. Now, so comedy comes along, and it's an imitation. What's it an imitation of? It's an imitation of agents' actions. So it's like tragedy that it's looking at agents' actions. But what kind of agents? Well, ones that are worse than the average person. So if we think of ourselves as just, average kinds of people doing our thing, comedy, Aristotle says, looks at people that are worse than us, right? Now, the notion of a worse agent, Aristotle, like the bad agent, right? Aristotle says this is actually a genus, right? So there are, in other words, there are species of bad agents. You could be bad in various ways, right? Now, what would some of those ways? Well, it could be, let's say, cruelty, destructive. So you could have agents that are cruel, destructive, basically causing damage, like really causing damage. That's one way that we could say someone is morally, like worse in a moral sense. The other one is somebody could be worse than us, and this isn't very nice when you think about it. But then again, this is Aristotle we're talking about, and a lot of what we may think today as nice or mean or whatever will not necessarily map onto what Aristotle and the ancient Greeks thought. So you have to be very careful not to import, contemporary notions back and read them into Aristotle. But nonetheless, let's carry on. So what he thinks, it's the comedy looks at the laughable, and it's a bit circular to say what's comedy about. Well, it's about the laughable. Well, what's the laughable? Well, that's comedy. But in any case, what he's really looking at is these are people that are laughable, they're ridiculous, but they don't really cause pain or damage. He does say, and it comes out differently in various translations, but this category of bad agent is kind of like the ridiculous and the silly, right? The ones that you would laugh at and just shake your head at and go, what a fool, right? That kind of stuff. And it's also got kind of a pejorative edge on it too, because it might be somebody who's foolish or might have might be connected, as the Greeks did. They connected the bad and the ugly, right? So if you look at the history of literature and a lot of art, somebody who's laughable or whatever might be connected with the appearance, right? And so there will be certain norms, Aristotle has them, of what is beauty and all these things. And if you fall short of that, you could very well land in the category of the ugly and the bad, right? Which is, starts that tradition where, when you look at the bad person in a movie, usually is not the best looking person. But that's not in every tradition, right? Because, like in the Judeo-Christian tradition, some of the, like Lucifer is originally sort of this beautiful bringer of light kind of thing. That's a different way of approaching this. For Aristotle, no, that's not. Sort of the beautiful is associated, like Plato said, with good, and ugly is bad, and all that kind of stuff. So, but this again, remember, this is the laughable, the ridiculous, not necessarily the malicious or causing damage. And it's interesting to note, if you flip on over to the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, says, let's talk a little bit about happiness. And when he's talking about happiness, he does, he ties it in to, health. So if you're unhealthy, could you really, if you're ugly and sick, could you really be happy? Aristotle's like, no, I don't think so. So again, Aristotle has what we today would regard as some pretty rough ideas, but they're there. So that's what the text seems to say. So we deal with it. Okay, so and make of that as how does that relate or whatever? How do we interpret this? But nonetheless, there seems to be that connection, and you find it in Homer as well. The judgments of the gods when they're reflecting on Achilles' actions and what he did to Hector and whatnot. So you can see this connection is in Greek thought. Aristotle is not just making this up, right? He's certainly in a tradition. So he does a little bit of history then in chapter 5. He says tragedy is better known than comedy, and so tragedy gets a better shake from Aristotle than comedy. And historically, tragedy has been regarded as a superior or a better or a more profound art form. And I think Robertson Davies, the great Canadian novelist, pointed out that you when you think about books that are regarded as extremely important and all that, they tend to be darker works that are like deal with sadder themes or whatever, because those are more important, as seem to be more important than works of comedy. And Robertson Davies said that's just kind of an old prejudice, and in a way you can trace it all the way back to the Greeks and to Aristotle. So he says tragedy is better known than comedy, and tragedy more or less kind of develops out of epic poetry. Tragedy is a more complex art form, and in a way, just a kind of a simple thing is that tragedy, as it grows and develops out of epic poetry, whatever is contained in epic poetry, you'll find in tragedy, but there are things in tragedy that you won't find in epic poetry. So it's a later development. And then later on, he's going to say which one is superior or whatever. Just because it has more stuff doesn't make it necessarily better. But that's for a later chapter. Aristotle will do kind of an evaluation of this. All right, so there's still more going on in chapter 5, but I'm going to jump now to chapter 6, where Aristotle gives us his very famous definition of tragedy. Basically, he's given us the parts. And he will go into more detail in these parts in ensuing chapters. Nonetheless, so tragedy, the definition, and I've been using this term. So there's your Greek term, mimesis, right? Imitation, and a lot of discussion as to exactly what imitation really is, right? Like, what does it mean to represent something? That is a huge discussion in philosophy and literary criticism. In this case, imitation of an action. Now, again, we're talking about agents and the stuff they do. So agent actions, and it is a serious, and it's heroic, and it's complete, right? So it tells a complete story, but not just simply a list, like a chronology. It's not like that. There's a sense of completion to it, right? You can't take away, you can't add. It's a finished kind of story product, and I'll talk a little bit more what that means when we get to plot. So how does it do this? Well, it's going to use language, of course, and it's going to use language with what Aristotle calls pleasurable accessories, right, in some translations, or useful functional accessories. And what are those? These are like ornaments of different kinds, like rhythm and harmony, right? So that's part of the language, right? Aristotle, if you recall in the previous video on the Poetics, I mentioned that Aristotle thinks of all this, again, it's natural. Rhythm and harmony are natural, right? We naturally will fall into, remember, the iambic mode of speaking, right? Where it's bum, 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 that kind of pattern when we talk. That's very common, and some poetry is written in like that. Homer wrote in hexameter. Aristotle says, not so natural to speak like that. That's a special kind of epic way of speaking. But rhythm and harmony these are very natural. And so language will use that, right? So it kind of dresses it up, it ornaments it up a little bit more fancy than the way we ordinarily speak, but not totally disconnected and still natural. And so there's a close connection, remember, with our art and life, and it's going to come out even more interestingly when we get to plot. All right, so and this language changes in the play. So sometimes it could be in a more simple kind of verse. form, and then it could sometimes be in song, and so different ornaments in different parts, right? So again, this is up to the writer in question on how to do this, but this is what the writer is actually doing, using language and putting it in this way in this particular part of the play. Okay, and essentially, when we're talking about tragedies, we are really talking about plays. Why? Because plays involve actors, right? It's not just language where someone just stands up and tells a story, like oration or like a rhapsode, not like that, where you're just singing the story, right? Like in Plato's Ion, right? When he's talking to Ion, right? Ion's rhapsode. He just walks around singing Homer stuff. It's not like they put Homer, they staged Homer. As a matter of fact, Aristotle will say that would look ridiculous, actually, if you tried to stage Homer. And think about it, some of these epic works, right? Like an epic poem, like the Iliad, right? You know, people have tried to make it into movies. Think about the stories sometimes out of the Bible and sacred literature. If you try to film that stuff, or put it on stage, Aristotle thinks it's going to look ridiculous, right? And that's an interesting thought too. So maybe the epic doesn't lend itself to the tragic mode, where in other words, you can't stage it, you can't film it. It's best, just to listen to Homer rather than trying to stage Homer. Okay, so anyway, so we got the language. It's ornamental. It's different things in different places, not in rhythm and song and all that kind of stuff. And also tragedy uses people, actors, right? So the actions that we're trying to imitate, right, the mimesis of the agent's actors, well, we're using actors on the stage to do that, right? So live action, as we might call it today. So the actors, not simply language, and it's not just simply verbal, right? So there's motions on the stage and whatnot, and a lot of the storytelling is done through the various motions on the stage. So the actions are imitating the actions, right? So action imitated by action, not always action described in language. So it's a more complex, as you can see, there's more stuff going on in epic poetry. You don't have this kind of stuff. It's all based on language. Now, an interesting thing that Aristotle mentions, and we all know this intuitively because there is a natural element. Think about it when people say, "Oh yeah, I love watching movies." Why? Well, something like movies like The Fast and the Furious. Why do you like those movies? Like lots of people do. And I just use that as an example of even the title, The Fast and the Furious. Well, it's very emotional, right? And it's fun. You watch it and it's like, wow, that was a real head rush. Or you like watching movies, like sad movies, right? You get out the box of Kleenex and you have a good cry over something. Why do we like that? We just do. We enjoy that. Think of people who love watching, like quote unquote slasher films, right? Where it's like, very violent or whatever. Those are very popular. Or watching a creepy movie like the classic The Shining, right? It's not just, sheer violence, but, the feeling of being deeply frightened. For some reason, we enjoy that. Why can we enjoy that? Well, the tragic, it arouses the emotions. Aristotle says it arouses lots of different emotions, primarily, though, pity and fear. But he says it does it in a way that is, as we would say, it's kind of safe. You get to be freaked out in a movie theater, but you're not actually in danger, right? So when you're watching, people racing down, racing cars, and you get that massive sort of head rush when you watch it, you're not actually in danger of crashing, even though you're frightened and you're watching and you're thinking, man, there's an accident waiting to happen here. If you get all that excitement, but no danger. Or you watch, a violent film or whatever, armies battling or whatever. Again, you're not in any danger, right? So it's this sort of suspension of a little bit of reality that you get to enjoy the emotion as if you were in danger, but you really aren't. So you get to purge the emotions. It's like it's kind of like having your cake and eating it too, because you get all the emotion, all the adrenaline rush, the pleasure out of the emotion, but none of the damage, right? Because you're not in any danger, right? So it's kind of a safe way to bring these emotions to the surface and not suffer any real consequences. So the villain that's on stage that's freaking you out is not actually going to hurt you, right? And then, even today we do it even more. We have, riders, and no animals or people were hurt in the making of this film. So enjoy watching all the carnage, because it's not real, but you get to watch it as if it were real and get all the emotions. And then you go, wow, nobody was really hurt. It was just, as the great Puck says at the end of the Shakespeare play, that if these visions have offended, just realize it's just a story and all is mended, right? And it's not really real, but you get to have the fun as if it were. Okay, now let's think a little bit more about this arousing of emotions. This is cathartic. It's a catharsis, right? So it's a cleanse. It's sometimes translated as a kind of cleansing. A catharsis is a cleansing. So a catharsis is a cleansing of these emotions. You get to do them. Oh, I feel better. So it's this tension, and then bang, it's a relief. And in that sense, but you don't pay any real price. There's no price. You just get sort of the fun, and you're done. Now, let's think more about this notion of the story. And so a tragedy does deal with a story, and Aristotle says there are 6 parts to a tragedy, right? And if you recall back in chapter 1 of the Poetics, he laid out, how these modes of everything is a mode of imitation, right? It's very natural. This is what we do. We learn through it. We enjoy imitating. It's just part of human nature, right? So to imitate, performing mimesis, that's natural. And also we have different ways and modes of mimesis, right? That's why that undifferentiated mass of, creative mimesis started to break up, and you get tragedy, epic poetry, comedy, and all that stuff. And remember, he said that these things are differentiated in 3 ways: the means, and the objects, and the manner. Okay, so the 6 parts of tragedy, the means are diction and song, right? So, basically the language and the rhythm and all these kinds of things. The spectacle is the manner, and the spectacle is like how are you imitating? And Aristotle goes through each of these in more detail in chapter 6, so you can have a look at that. Then number 4 and 5 and 6, these are the objects, right? So plot, character, and thought. And those are the objects of tragedy. And he singles out plot. This is the soul. This is the main part of tragedy, is plot. Now, but it's Aristotle. He talks about plot, and he says it's kind of this collection, but it's not just an aggregate. A collection as in an aggregate. It's an organized collection with a direction. Right? Because after all, remember, the mimesis going on in tragedy is the mimesis, the imitation of an action, which is complete, right? So it's not just sort of this list that just kind of starts out of nowhere and ends up or just stops. So it's not an abrupt beginning and just an arbitrary type of end. There's more to the story here. What's going on here? Well, a simple way is to borrow an idea from E.M. Forster, who was a novelist in the early 20th century, wrote things, like very beginning of the century, wrote things like Room with a View. That's all most of his works have been made into movies. You can check that out. Like Room with a View in around 1908, Howard's End a couple years later, around 1910. And then probably his most famous work is A Passage to India, which is in the mid-20s, around 24, it comes out. But a couple years after that, he writes, E.M. Forster was also an essayist and a critic, in addition to being a novelist, and he writes a little work, Aspects of the Novel. Very interesting work. And he says something like this, which, he didn't make all this up. It's kind of riffing on what Aristotle meant by plot. And remember, plot is part of a tragedy, which is imitating an action, and it's complete. Well, what does that mean? Well, roughly, you have a story which would be, and this is Forster's example, the king died and the queen died. That's just kind of a list, right? It just kind of, you know, it's just there. It's just an aggregate, right? It's only two things, but it's just, that's it. It's just this list. King, or a chronology. King died, then, and the queen died, right? And it might be just temporal, as in a chronology. The king died in the morning, and the queen died in the afternoon, right? And the only thing roughly that links them, is, in your mind at least, is there's just a king and a queen, and they both died on the same day. And yeah, they might have been, they were married or something like that. But that's, again, just still an aggregate. But if we change it just a little bit by just adding one more element in it that links them in a particular way, it goes like this: the king died and the queen died of grief. Now you've got a causal relationship here. King's death, the queen's death, and the king's death causes the queen's death because of grief. So there is something that not only helps to link them, but relate them in a causal manner. And so this is also what that's plot, right? So plot is something, not just an aggregate, not just an organization in temporally, but kind of a causal organization where stuff fits together in a causal way. And in that case, now you've got a plot. And the interesting thing to think about is this is, again, all part of something that's mimesis, right? So the plot is part of tragedy. Tragedy is, remember, imitation, mimesis, right? So Aristotle seems to be saying that when you are imitating, right, when you're trying to imitate actions, that life is full of causality, right? And it's not necessarily the case that it's just something. Fiction is not something that we just impose on the world. It is a very natural response to the world, and it is reflecting parts of the world, namely this causal nature. So to do tragedy, you have to have its soul, which is plot, and this has a notion of causality and connection to it. Okay, so there you go. Aristotle and again, he'll talk more in section 6 about all these different parts. He thinks that's it. He thinks he's got a complete theory of it. And he's also going to pick up more on plot, because later on he wants to talk about, well, how do you build a plot? And we'll get more into sort of like what are the parts involved. So he comes around to that a lot. But the key thing is that plot is your important thing for tragedy, which again is a mimesis and has complete, and this notion of catharsis, that it's something that it's very good for us, right? And we do it in a way where there are no real consequences. So there's tension and release, and no real consequences except the pleasure of the tension and the release, and the relief afterwards of, oh, I feel like I've kind of like after you've had a good cry, it's like, yeah, I cleared my head. Like I'm really upset about something or really freaked out about something. What a great performance. And don't we say, just to conclude, that if something does not move you like that, doesn't freak you out, doesn't upset, make you cry, make you laugh or whatever, not so much laugh because we're dealing with tragedy here, but if something is going to be a serious work, it has to move your emotions seriously, right? And if it doesn't, you think, meh, what was the big deal about that? And that, we would say, is a lousy work of art.